Well, thank you, everybody. We got, I'm sure, a great briefing from John on where the administration's perspective is on all this, and the actual technical elements of the agreement itself, which is a really great way to set the basic framework for this discussion now. What we thought we would do here is have a discussion. We have three great panelists speaking about different elements of how the region is going to react to the nuclear agreement. What can we expect? And really we have, there's a lot of protagonists in the region, but I think we can say there are three fundamental major protagonists. One being Iran and what happens internally inside of Iran and what kind of policies and behavior does the Iranian regime pursue in the aftermath. Two being the Gulf states overall, but most importantly among those, Saudi Arabia, and how obviously the concerns that it's expressed about the nuclear agreement, even if they're much more quiet, I think you can still sense the signals coming out of Saudi, and we know Ash Carter will be there later this week to have some conversations with the Saudi leadership about the agreement. And finally, Israel, where I think the objections have been much more vociferous and clearly stated by the Prime Minister, and the tension now that exists in the U.S.-Israel relationship to basically going forward, and obviously the Secretary of Defense is there today and meeting with the Prime Minister, I believe right now, if that might still be going on. So anyway, I thought what we would do is we'd have a few minutes of Q&A with each of our three panelists, and I'll introduce them one at a time as we have a discussion, and then we can open it up after that for questions. So we will start with Dr. Suzanne Maloney, who is the Interim Deputy Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and a Senior Fellow in the Brookings Center for Middle East Policy, where her research is focused on Iran and Persian Gulf energy. Suzanne has published multiple books on Iran focused on the economy and the internal dynamics inside the Islamic Republic. Before joining Brookings, she served on the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Board, and really is just one of the best people in town to talk to about what's going on inside of Iran. So we're very happy to have her with us today. And Suzanne, I'd like to start by asking you, we heard the president when he announced the agreement this past week lay out very clearly that this is an arms control agreement, say that there still are regional differences that exist with Iran on Syria, Iraq, Israel, Yemen, but we also heard him talk about the possibilities of a new direction inside of Iran, that the agreement could lend itself to potential for over time a shift in the overall Islamic Republic's foreign policy and internal dynamics and the empowerment of more pragmatic voices and forces. And I'm interested to get your assessment. How do you see the internal politics playing out in Iran in the aftermath of the agreement over the next few years in terms of these different factions and groups?
Thanks, Ilan. I hope you all can hear me. These are nifty microphones and beyond my technological capabilities. But I really want to thank you and CNAS for organizing such a great group of people, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation among all of the people here and everyone in the audience. I think the sort of question of what does this mean for Iran is perhaps the most interesting, and in a way it underlies everything that we're doing with this deal and everything that will happen in the way that it's implemented. As the president said, the deal itself is not predicated on the assumption of political change and progress in Iran, but it is infused in everything that is contained within the deal, including a lot of the provisions that will, I think, effectively make it more complicated and potentially even more difficult for the United States to deal with Iran, the other threats posed by Iran around the region in terms of imposing sanctions or undertaking other actions that the Iranians can then assert are in some way contrary to the spirit or obligations of the United States under this deal. So in effect, should Iran not change, it's going to be very difficult and I think inherently full of tension to continue to see this deal hold over the course of its entire lifespan. That said, I am not optimistic about short-term change in Iran. This is really more of a historical perspective than it is a reflection of current dynamics, although I think the current dynamics matter. There's a perception of Rouhani as a kind of successor to the previous smiling, urbane cleric, Mohammad Khatami, But within the world of Iranian politics, they come from very different factions. Rouhani, despite the sense that he managed to persuade many of the reformist and oppositionists within the Iranian population to come around and support him during the 2013 elections, is someone whose factional alignments within Iran have always laid very clearly with the conservative camp, albeit the more pragmatic wing of that conservative camp. He has found ways, I think, to evolve his views to some extent, but ultimately his interests are in preserving the regime. And I think that extends to Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, the negotiator of this deal, who in many ways has served as the face of a new Iran for much of the media and certainly for those who were involved in the negotiations. So I'm not persuaded Rouhani, in effect, is looking to wholly transform the Iranian regime to begin with. But even if, for example, he were, I think that what we've seen in the past is that when Iranian politicians try to move the system in a more moderate direction, there are a number of factors that intercede to make that difficult, if not impossible. And we saw a lot of them play out over the course of both the Rafsanjani presidency, the president who took over Iran in the aftermath of the war with Iraq and tried to reconstruct the economy, as well as during the reformist presidency of Mohammad Khatami. First and foremost, the system is really stacked against moderation. The levers of power that remain in the hands of those who would oppose any kind of moderation, either political moderation within Iran or moderation of Iran's foreign policy, are very firmly in the hands of extremists. And they're willing to use those levers of power, whether it's the power of the judiciary, the power of the security forces, or simply the use of violence on a societal basis. So that in and of itself makes it, I think, very difficult. And what we've also seen is that in the kind of competitive political landscape of Iran, extremists tend to do better. In fact, the Iranian population itself has turned repeatedly against some of the moderates, whether it was Rafsanjani or Khatami, out of frustration that they're unable to get their agendas implemented. And I think that's one of the potential challenges that will face Rouhani were he to be interested in making some kind of a systemic change. But my fundamental presumption is that for the Iranians, this, as Rafsanjani and some previous efforts to moderate Iran were, this is not a systemic change. This is selective. It is an attempt at damage control to solve a problem, to get Iran out from under the yoke of sanctions, rather than a kind of transformational shift in the way that Iran approaches the world. The final issue that I think I just mentioned, and we'll probably get into some of the other pieces of our discussion, is just the extent to which, even the best laid plans tend to go awry with respect to Iran and within Iran. And so even where you've had presidents or political figures who've tried to push Iran in a more moderate direction in the past, what we found is that events intercede. This happened in the aftermath of the Gulf War. This happened with Khatami, albeit more internally. And I think that, when we see the array of threats on the landscape and the challenges that Iran itself is facing around the region, I think we see a lot of impetus for a continuing assertiveness in its regional foreign policy, and potentially the empowerment of those who really are absolutely convinced on retaining the current system and its current balance of power.
Let me follow up with you, Suzanne, on one question here. I think, and I very much agree that historically, if you look at Iran, the moderates don't often win out. But in this case, they did seem to win out. You could make the argument, at least on the nuclear program, that if you asked me at least 2 or 3 years ago, are you going to have Rouhani elected, who, he's not a reformer, but more pragmatic, let's say, certainly than an Ahmadinejad. And if you were going to actually get to a nuclear agreement with them that limits their nuclear program, I would have said, I'll tell you, in 2012, I would have said you're crazy. And here we are. And so does that speak to, is there, even if it's not the most likely scenario, is it a possibility, or should we be thinking about at least ways to help move that along or leave that possibility open, or is your view that the likelihood is so low that really we just need to be thinking about it more from just an assumption that this is not fundamentally going to change the overall system, or their overall, even forget the overall system, their overall foreign policy?
Look, let me just predicate everything, and I should have said this at the outset. This is Iran. If you try to predict what's going to happen in Iran, you're automatically going to get yourself into trouble, and you're automatically going to come up short against the reality of a country that has proven to be unpredictable and defy most of the expectations of certainly those of us who sit this far away time and time again. So anything is possible when it comes to Iran, and that's one of the things that Rouhani said in his inaugural speech. Anything is possible if this nuclear deal can be solved. But my fundamental presumption is not that the moderates won with respect to this deal. My fundamental presumption is that the system got what it wanted, which is a way out of a problem. And that, in effect, is why the nuclear agreement is not likely to be upended by any party within the Iranian political system, so long as the terms as we understand them, as released last week, fundamentally stand and aren't altered during the course of the political debate here. I think the Iranians are not happy. The political system is not happy about having to give up a certain number of its obsolete centrifuges or to put much of its LEU into some non-usable form and to take these other measures and to deal with the kind of inspection and verification regime that was put in place as a result of the deal. But it was a price the system itself was willing to pay. It was not something that Rouhani and Zarif foisted upon an unwilling Islamic Republic. This was a consensus move 2 years ago that the internal disarray that Ahmadinejad had caused and the external price of sanctions and isolation from the international financial system and from the world more generally was a price that the Islamic Republic didn't want to pay. And the only question that's remained between June 2013 and the finalization of this deal has been, what price would Iran be willing to pay in order to get over this problem? And I think what they agreed to last week was an improvement upon what they've previously put forward. But it was not a cost that I think Khamenei or others were unwilling to pay, and I think that's why we were able to get the deal.
Thanks. I'm sure we'll come back to you in a couple minutes. I want to move on now to Melissa Dalton. Melissa is a fellow and chief of staff at CSIS, International Security Program, where her research focuses on security cooperation, U.S. defense policy in the Middle East, and defense strategy and policy. Prior to CSIS, she served in a number of positions at the U.S. Department of Defense in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and I actually had the opportunity to work with Melissa in the Middle East office when she was the desk officer for Syria and Lebanon for a couple of years, and she also had the opportunity, I know, to work very closely with CNES's CEO, Michel Flournoy. So, Melissa, I want to ask you really about the regional, the Arab response, and really the GCC response, first of all. I mean, President Obama met with Saudi Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir on Friday. Secretary Carter is in Jeddah this week. It seems like the initial Gulf state public reaction has been to support the agreement, but at the same time, you can look at folks like Prince Bandar, Prince Turki bin Faisal, and the sort of former Saudi officials who sometimes speak more freely and really represent in some ways the regime or the leadership, and you see a very different sort of reaction. So, how do you think they're taking this, and what is the Gulf states' major concerns? Why are the Saudis so worried about this agreement?
Great. Thanks so much for having me on, and I too look forward to a great discussion here today with my fellow panelists and with the audience. I think I would characterize the public reaction from the Arabs and primarily the GCC states as resigned acceptance. The administration has gone to great strides in the run-up to sealing the deal with Iran, to conduct diplomatic outreach bilaterally, multilaterally. President Obama convened the Camp David summit earlier this spring to attempt to assure our Arab partners that we have their interests in mind, that particularly their security interests in mind as the United States pursues this, or has pursued this deal. But privately, as you mentioned, Alon, I think the deal very much feeds long-standing fears in the Gulf in a number of ways. I think that there has been actually a trust deficit that has emerged amongst the United States and primarily its Gulf partners over the last few years, starting with the precipitation of the Iraq-Afghanistan drawdown in the region, the announcement of the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, And then the perception in the Gulf that the United States has focused almost exclusively on the Iranian nuclear issue and not really investing or paying as much attention to the asymmetric capabilities of the Iranians and the political influence of Iran in the region, which I believe our Arab partners think is a far more significant threat than the nuclear issue. So there's, as I mentioned, this trust deficit that has deepened, and with the Iranian nuclear deal now sealed and questions though remaining in terms of how solid it will be going forward, I think that there's a great deal of skepticism expressed privately, and as you mentioned, by some of the surrogates, the former government officials in the Gulf, in terms of how credible the deal is going to be. Is Iran going to actually live up to its commitments? Will the lifting of economic sanctions actually flush Iranian coffers with money that might be used to further build asymmetric capabilities in the region and allow Iran to poke around in places like Yemen, Syria, and Iraq in ways that our Arab partners view as very destabilizing and contrary to their interests? So that's how I see their read of the deal.
And as you're saying, I mean, the administration, we had John Wolfstall here earlier, has tried to go out of its way early on, with this Camp David summit, with all the consultations they're now having. There seems to be a very robust effort to try and reassure the Gulf states. Do you think it's working so far, or what's your assessment of the American approach thus far?
I think that there's some good initial steps. I think the instincts are right to bring together or attempt to bring together the political echelon in the Gulf, with efforts to bolster our security cooperation and investments in the Gulf. But I think what's missing is a demonstration of U.S. leadership in the region, and particularly on Syria and Iraq and Yemen. As I mentioned, those are the areas that the Gulf countries I think are most concerned about in terms of what Iran has been doing and what it potentially could do going forward. And so the need for a greater dialogue and actual movement forward to address those problems from a political perspective, I think, is what the Gulf countries will be truly looking forward. Although I am sure that they will welcome, further investments in their security capabilities, which I'm happy to, speak about as well.
We'll do. And I wanted to ask you one more question on this. We talk about the Gulf as this monolithic, creature. Saudi Arabia's position is the position of all the other GCC states. Is that really the case, or has this agreement and some of the reactions caused any fissures inside the system itself amongst it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. We tend to refer to the GCC as the GCC. There's the primary factor that's in play in the region right now is the Saudi-Iran kind of Cold War, if you will. That's happening in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And so that's driving a lot of the instability and potential for escalation in the region. But you're absolutely right to point out that the Gulf reaction overall is what's somewhat varied. If you consider places like Bahrain or Oman, and even to a certain extent Kuwait, and even the dynamic between Dubai and Abu Dhabi is different. The smaller Gulf states have longstanding historical and economic ties to Iran. Oman actually played a key role in opening the dialogue with the United States and Iran that was quite useful. And then in the Emirates, although they, like Saudi Arabia, are quite strong on voicing their concerns privately about where Iran might be headed, there are significant economic ties between Dubai and Iran that I think somewhat affect the internal calculus of the Emiratis as well. So,
great, and we'll come back to you in a minute. Also, I want to now bring in our third panelist, David Makovsky. David is a Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Project on the Middle East Peace Process. He's written numerous books about the Middle East peace process, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and also a lot lately on Israel and Iran and that dynamic. And, perhaps most importantly for me, David and I were, comrades in arms during Secretary Kerry's previous attempts at negotiation before the Iran deal on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when I really had an opportunity to get to know David. So, David, it's really great to have you here today. And I thought I'd start by asking you a very simple question. The U.S. and Israel have a special relationship and are as close as two countries can be in some ways, and yet here we are today. How did we get here? What has happened? What has gone wrong in the last few months?
All right, thanks for the easy ones, Elon. Well, first of all, it's a delight to be with you. I really enjoyed our time together, and it's an honor to be with such panelists and to learn from them. So thank you for having me. Look, I think, the fundamental point is that, that from where Israel sits, this thing went way off track, and that the original objective was to eliminate the prospects for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And what's happened is that has morphed subtly but profoundly into managing the Iranian nuclear program. We still say we don't want them to get a weapon, but by the policy choices we have made, it has led to a real parting of the ways. I mean, you could trace it to issues like zero enrichment or not. I mean, to get technical about it, but I think the overarching critique, in Israel would be twofold. One is that while they would acknowledge for 15 years, and even Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that publicly when everyone said Iran would cheat because they cheated, according to the IAEA, for so long, he says, I think they might not cheat because the payoff at year 15 is so big that the caps on, which actually are lifted even before year 15 on centrifuge production, they will have industrial capacity for that, and that the stockpile that has been depleted, which is one of the big achievements of this deal, going from 10,000 kilo to 300, capping the number of centrifuges, I think the plutonium thing of taking out the core, filling it with cement, that blocks that pathway for a while, probably beyond 15 years for a variety of technical reasons, and they wouldn't contest that. Their critique is really twofold, which is at year 15, when, to put it in sports terms, being that I like sports, is like they're out of the penalty box. They're back on the ice with everybody else. There's no caps on their centrifuges. There's no caps on their stockpile. Who is going to stop this country from making that final dash to a bomb? And with all the words that the president says, they haven't heard an answer yet. And so I think that's one. And the second critique, which both of my colleagues have said really here, is their critique, which is the amount of money that will be available to their proxies by unlocking their frozen bank assets once they come into compliance with Vienna or JCPOA, maybe as soon as next June. $150 billion, I think is what the president has said. And let's say even a large majority goes to Iranian roads and clinics, it's still going to be a lot of money. I mean, the Iranian defense budget, I think I've seen numbers at 15 billion. I've seen the president say 30 billion. Most, I think, say 15. I think the Israeli defense budget is 8, but they get 3 billion from the United States, 11. But 150 billion, and even assuming the majority goes to the civilian infrastructure, it's just an order of magnitude that is mind-boggling there. And maybe in America, it's like, this is all far away. The Middle East is a mess anyway. But they don't see what is the answer on those two critiques. And no matter what else is said, they keep coming back to those two critiques. And when the president said, well, we can't solve all the problems at once. We can only solve one. We can solve the nuclear. We can't solve that. They would find that more convincing if the terrorism issue was somehow revenue neutral, I would say. But when you throw 150 billion with a B into the mix, and again, not all 150, but because, I think as, Suzanne said, I mean, it's not just the Rouhani wing is going to get a win, but you're going to have to give the IRGC, the deep state of Qasem Soleimani a win. So and that is not including new money for new oil revenue, new business ventures. So it's, that you'd say it's a lower end number. They just find they're going to be left with a Middle East on steroids, that this is a Faustian bargain that to defer a nuclear issue for 15 years, they have been left with a more empowered Iran to destabilize the region from day one, or day 9 months, let's say. And it's those two critiques that I think they feel they haven't heard an answer to.
Thanks, David. And I'm wondering, you talk about they as the Israelis. But, you have Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have opponents who are actually criticizing him now, not about the agreement, but about execution and U.S.-Israel relations. You have the security establishment, which has a bit of a different perspective, though similar on all this. Can you maybe try to break that down for us?
Okay,
Like,
great.
what's going on?
Here's the thing. Lapid, who was Netanyahu's finance minister, usually to Netanyahu's left, is outflanking him from the right. He's saying, this is such a horrible deal that the Americans have done, and you're to blame because you have a poor relationship with Obama. Maybe you could have mitigated it somewhat if you had better relations. But it isn't a critique on the deal itself. They're all echoing it. Herzog, the head of the Labor Party, has not yet joined the government, even though Netanyahu clearly wants to use this as no crisis should go to waste and turn it into an opportunity to broaden his government. But he says, I hate this deal too, but I could do that from the opposition. I mean, there's been a lot of talk of even a joint op-ed piece between the two of them to show unity. The polls so far have been 70 to 80% against. The discordant vote, I think, is from more in the think tank world, from some of the experts, a guy like Eli Levita, who I think is probably one of the smartest I have encountered in terms of being creative and a problem solver. His piece was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And he'll say, look, at least say 15 years is something. And it is. And it would be wrong, it would be churlish not to acknowledge that. So there's more of a recognition, I think, in that narrow world of the kind of the policy intellectuals that 15 years is something, and the Middle East is so turbulent and so is in such an upheaval that 15 years is something, and the region just shouldn't blow up in the 16th year, but 15 years is already good. So I mean, they are more willing to acknowledge the good in the agreement, which Netanyahu is not willing to do, and I think for tactical reasons, because he's got his eye on the congressional vote. And it's the same reason why he, maybe we'll talk about it, what a package could be for Israel, but his latest line is, if this was a good agreement, no one would have to even talk about a compensation package. And so it might be the first time in history of the U.S.-Israel relations that you have a prime minister saying, I don't want your money, I don't want your hardware, just leave me alone. And I think he's doing it because tactically he fears that anything that would somehow dilute the intensity of his objection, the moral clarity of his opposition, would somehow be used against him in that congressional vote. So you could say he's doubling down, and what if he loses that bet, which I think is a very fair question, but he doesn't want anything to muddy those waters.
But potentially, after the deal goes down in Congress, those options still
Right.
remain.
I think then you'll see the defense community assert itself more. But right now, you've got a prime minister who is in such a white-hot anger mode that nobody wants to, get in that way. So, but I agree that we're going to hear their voices more often. And I think, frankly, even from the Netanyahu circles, what I'm picking up is, okay, it doesn't happen with this administration, it'll happen with the next administration. They don't feel there's a window here closing, because you could say that their leverage is best before the congressional vote, but that is certainly not the approach this prime minister is taking.
So let me ask a question to all three of you, actually. We've heard the lay down on what's going on with, in Iran, in the Gulf, and in Israel. The United States, at least the president, the people around him, and I, at least personally, I would argue, has made the decision that this is in the U.S. interest. and has consulted with its P5+1 partners and come up with, I think, unanimity, at least amongst many of the world's great powers, that this is in the world's interest, whether one agrees with it or not. And even aside from all the proliferation benefits, though, we do have these complications now in the region and these dynamics of what's going to happen in Iran. What do you recommend to the United States should do now in the region, and how should it approach this very complicated aftermath of the agreement in terms of moving forward, both in terms of our policy towards Iran, towards the Gulf, and towards Israel? So maybe I'll start with Suzanne and your take on this.
Look, I think the president is right. This is the best alternative that we have at this particular moment in time. It may not be the best possible deal that could have been negotiated, but given the other options that we have available to us today, we have to go all in on the deal. We have to ensure that it gets through the Congress, which I think it will. And then I think we have to demonstrate that we're both testing the possibilities with Iran, despite the skepticism about some sort of kind of breakthrough change in the character of the regime or the approach of the Islamic Republic at home or abroad. But I also think we have to demonstrate that we're capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, that we're capable of implementing this accord to its utmost, but that implementing this accord will not tie our hands behind our back in addressing the range of other concerns that we have about Iranian behavior in the region and Iranian behavior at home, which is, I think, as big a concern in the aftermath of this deal for Iranians as the troublemaking around the region is for its neighbors.
Can you give maybe like an example or two of what that would actually look like? Or?
Well, I think one of the concerns that I mentioned at the outset is that the obligations of the deal, the way the deal is structured and written, we're going to have a lot of difficulty in sort of imposing the ultimate penalty for concerns about breaches of the deal, because it will appear to be, it will wreck the deal if we call the Iranians and try to move to a snapback scenario. The Iranians are then no longer under their obligations to continue to enforce the restraints on their nuclear program. So I think there's going to be a lot of trepidation about doing that. And what the administration has said all along is that, yes, we have a range of alternatives. The unfortunately described Chinese menu of sanctions that remain on the books that we'll be able to continue to enforce and to redesignate particular Iranian institutions. I think the administration is going to need to show that it's capable of taking those sort of non-deal wrecking actions on the implementation of the deal, but it's also got to demonstrate that those authorities that remain on the books, whether it's Executive Order 13224 that targets terrorist financing and activity, that we're prepared to designate Iranian entities and prepared to go after Tehran for its continued role around the region. So I think we have a lot of ability to create pain for the Iranian state as a result of its actions. I'm just not convinced in the aftermath of this deal we're prepared to take those actions.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I was talking actually with my colleague Liz Rosenberg about earlier. You hear on the next panels. In some ways, there is this default when you're dealing with countering Iranian terrorism, where we default to sanctions because they're the easiest tool and they're the least risky tool, as opposed to some of the things the intelligence community can do or the Department of Defense can do. But it might, ironically or sort of paradoxically, in this case, sanctions for terrorism might risk the agreement, whereas more aggressive action elsewhere might actually list the agreement less.
Might risk the agreement less, but it might
yeah.
create an escalatory spiral
Right.
with the Iranians in the region that would be equally problematic. I don't think there are going to be any simple solutions, but I think that, as you suggest, and I know you have some interesting and I think very valuable ideas for how the administration can address this outside of sanctions. We have to be prepared to demonstrate to Tehran that this deal is not going to leave us on the defensive with respect to the range of other concerns.
Melissa, maybe we can have you discuss so how we try to fix things with the GCC here, but also more broadly other recommendations you have for the Obama administration going forward in the region.
Great, thanks. The inertia of the administration is going to inevitably lead it to make investments in security cooperation, offer additional security assurances through multilateral exercises, building strike capabilities, maritime security, missile defense, and all of that is good to do. But as I mentioned earlier, the real gap here is at the political level and addressing some of the fundamental challenges in the region. In addition, we have seen a growing propensity in the Gulf to take independent action to address some of their security concerns as they perceive an absence of U.S. leadership on Yemen and in Syria and Iraq. And so very fundamentally, there needs to be a greater push for a multilateral dialogue to discuss what outcomes are we actually trying to achieve together with our partners in the region to address Yemen, to address Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State, and the potential for Iran to increase its support to proxies and destabilizing activities in the region. What outcomes are we trying to achieve? What objectives do we need to aim for to get there? And then have a discussion about the capabilities that we need to build at the military level in support of that strategy. I think that should be the main focus of the administration going forward. And as a part of that, I would hope to see a new strategy that seeks to deter and contain Iranian activities in the region, while at the same time building confidence with our Gulf partners to allow for the possibilities to test whether Iran can be a more constructive player in the region. I think there's a great deal of skepticism on our side, as well as particularly in the Gulf and with Israel, that's possible. But the trick in creating a deterrence and containment strategy is that how do you prevent escalation, prevent Iranian greater aggression and investments in their proxies, but at the same time searching for possible ways, whether it's in the tactical maritime domain, in other areas, to test for possible avenues of, I wouldn't say cooperation, but confidence-building measures with the Iranians.
Sure, and one other question, Melissa. We talk a lot, and I did gear this question is towards what the United States should do, but the Gulf has something to do here too, obviously.
Yes.
Their perspective, is they do seem to, their prescription of the problem is everything that ails us is coming out of Iran, which I think a lot of, at least in the U.S. side, folks would question. I wonder if you can sort of see what do the Gulf states need to do to step up and take on their part of this equation?
Right. I think it gets to a more sensitive, point of engagement with the Gulf countries, and that's their own internal security vulnerabilities that Iran is able to exploit with its destabilizing tactics and through its proxies. And so, the United States doesn't have a great track record on engaging regimes in the region to address these types of governance, human rights issues, but I think we need to remain firm on that and press for greater action on the part of the Gulf countries, pointing out the fact that those are vulnerabilities that Iran is able to exploit, and if that is what they are really concerned about, is Iran's kind of political subversion and asymmetric capability, then perhaps they need to shore up their internal security vulnerabilities by addressing some of the governance concerns.
Sure. Now David, in terms of how we try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again with the Israelis right now, what would you recommend for both President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu in terms of things that they can do going forward? Or is this basically an issue of waiting out the next year and a half, and these two guys are never going to be able to really come together?
Look, there's the personal dimension, which, there's never going to be a romance here between the two, and you'll just have to stabilize whatever possible. But I think the overarching critique, which again, I think my colleagues and I are saying similar ideas, is how do you, really instill a sense of deterrence that would not renegotiate this deal, but work at the edges, but that could have an impact because the Israeli critique is similar, than others. The regionalists are very focused on the Iranian proxies to destabilize through asymmetric warfare, but it seems to me that the kind of thread that threads through all these critiques is how do you reinforce deterrence? If Israel's critique is, what about year 15? Who's going to stop these guys from making a dash? I was part of this bipartisan policy group that came out with recommendations before there was a deal. We have not taken a position on the deal itself. We're looking for more clarifications at this point, but I think that the key is, are we in the U.S. Congress going to be able to say in year 15, I mean, this president will be long gone, but if you do break out, you know, the U.S. will not just have all options on the table, but will use force. It's clearly a last resort. Nobody wants that. The whole idea of doing this deal is to avoid war in many ways, but at the same time, you know, we have certain red lines with our allies, and I think that would certainly cool the waters on that. But I think it's not just about that. If it's on the regional piece that I spoke about before, you know, and I would reinforce something Suzanne said. Are we going to redesignate? Some of these guys are multiply listed for non-proliferation, for proliferation and terrorism and human rights. Are we going to do that? And on the issue of like consequences of penalties, yes, if you read the agreement, there's the ultimate consequence, which is the whole deal comes apart, which, you know, if you want this deal to pass, you obviously don't want that. But what are the penalties lower down for smaller violations? They said they're going to enrich at 3.67, but they enrich at 7% or something. What are we going to do? I think we should use the time between now and the next 60 days and work with our European allies, with Britain, with France, with Germany. If you read the snapback, together we're 4, and we're a majority in the snapback committee. And do we have a common interpretation of what the agreement is, and in terms of what the penalties are? What I'm trying to say is, I don't believe that you could renegotiate this deal, whatever the critiques are. The question is, can you compensate for them by working the edges, by using deterrence by common interpretation with our European allies, by dealing with redesignations? The Israelis will think that they're kind of left helpless there. The clear thing they've been focused on is the MOP, which is the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. They don't have an airplane to get there. It's only the B-52 and the B-2. You don't deliver it tomorrow, but you say before year 15. You'll have year 8 or whatever it is to train on that, so that you're not defenseless in year 15. And after year 15, you know, we make our statement clear now. So the thread, I think the common denominator thread in all this is reassuring allies is, how are we going to stop the Iranian kind of ability to use this agreement to become emboldened as a power in the Middle East? And I think we've got to think along, you know, 10 or 15 categories where we could use deterrence. And I think it's not about gutting the agreement for those who support it. And I'm not coming out endorsing it or coming out against it, but I'm saying that we should be creative in how do we work with our allies at the edges here to do it. I think every single one of us are saying that this will embolden Iran, and how do we deal with that to offset that prospect?
Sure, and for the Israelis, I mean, having that kind of conversation would require coming back in now, obviously. You think, I mean, would you recommend that to the Prime Minister?
Look, I clearly, I mean, I think Yossi Cohen led a delegation to see Susan Rice, Yossi Cohen being Netanyahu's national security advisor. I tend to think what's invariably going to happen, because in the ideal world, I would say, yes, come to the table tomorrow. But knowing where the dynamic is, I tend to think that the dust is going to have to settle on the congressional votes for that to happen. I mean, Aaron Miller's phrase is, you know, this relationship is too big to fail. I just think there's too much at stake. And as you pointed out in your opening remarks, there is a special relationship here. It's bigger than any, you know, relationship between two leaders. Like I said, no romance there, but I do think there's so much at stake that there needs to be a real strategic dialogue between these two countries and look at all the different dimensions and where deterrence can be reinforced. And I would certainly say we in the U.S. should do it with our friends in the Gulf and with our European allies as well. So I don't mean it in a mutually exclusive way by any sense. I think it's the U.S.-Arab relationship, the U.S.-European relationship. We should work this at every single level possible.
Great. Well, thank you. I think with that, we'll open it up for questions. Right here. Yep, gentleman with the I think we got microphones coming. Oh, no, it was the, there we go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. My name is Farzan Sabed. I'm a visiting fellow at Georgetown University. So my question is to Dr. Maloney, but also open to the floor. President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif have been pushing what they call a world against violent extremism agenda, which seeks to create kind of at least in appearance, a cooperative middle ground on a range of regional conflicts. So from the Iranian perspective, this would probably involve acknowledging Iranian interests in places like Western Syria and Iraq. But the dynamic in the region appears to be kind of moving towards confronting what is seen as a resurgent post-deal Iran. So my question is, how serious versus purely rhetorical do you think President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif kind of world against violence extremism agenda is? And do the regional dynamics really allow for such an initiative to create a regional level detente on issues like ending the civil war in Syria and Yemen and fighting common threats in Iraq? Thank you.
The wave, that was President Rouhani's follow-up UN Security Council speech last year. It didn't go over quite as well as his first one did, but maybe it will take off this year. Look, I believe that Rouhani represents this kind of centrist faction within the regime, and that faction, and I believe it has wide consensus, is not bent on sort of regional troublemaking or simple destruction of the order within the broader Middle East. There is a consensus that Iran's interests are best served by a good offense in the case of dealing with ISIS and in the preservation of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, but also that Iran's fundamental security is predicated on greater prosperity and engagement with Europe in particular, not a turn toward the east, but a return to the west. And those are going to be factors that I think shape a willingness to at least test the possibilities of some kind of greater engagement with the United States where it suits Iran's interests, not in respect to sort of conceding some of these fundamental interests like the preservation of Assad. I think that Iran can be managed in part because it is not a purely destructive, evil regime, but one that has some pragmatic constraints within it. But obviously, as you suggest, there is a cycle of escalation within the region. There is I think, a real new era in Saudi foreign policy, which is not entirely or even wholly positive, gauged not just from the Iranian perspective, but from the American perspective as well. I don't know that we can entirely predict what a 29-year-old defense minister who has a fairly weak king and father may do next. So I do recognize that there are going to be factors that can drive this situation, irrespective of the preferences of Washington or Tehran, into a more dangerous set of circumstances. And I think, as both of my fellow panelists have suggested, the major priority has to be now in working all of these relationships in a way that addresses both the worst possibilities of what Iran might do, but also how our allies might respond in ways that are problematic.
Either of you want to weigh in on that, or should we just move on? Right here, actually, let's go. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Samira. I'm from the Center for the National Interest. My first question is geared mainly towards Dr. Maloney, but can go to anyone in the panel. You mentioned that the deal doesn't signify a political shift in Iran, but I was wondering if we look beyond the political shift and look more into the economic incentives for Iran. If Iran is now open to regional economics and to work more closely with the different countries, if, for example, it builds oil pipelines and stuff throughout the region, do you think that would incentivize Iran to have a more responsible approach to the Middle East and have less incentive to destabilize the region and more incentive to work closely because it has economic responsibilities? And then moving on to the regional implications, or continuing to the regional implications, if we've exhausted our political leverage in curbing Iran's foreign policy. Do you think now that we have the opportunity to work with business and investment in Iran, if we're able to incentivize Iran to change its foreign policy, not due to diplomacy and stuff like that, but due to actual economic incentives? With the deal, the first people that are going to invest in Iran will be Russia, China, Asia, the rest of the Middle East, but they don't have the same technical expertise and capacity that America does. So do you think that would incentivize Iran to work more closely with America?
Sure, I'll give it to Suzanne, though I will also mention that there's a whole second panel that's going to focus precisely on this question, on the economy.
Yeah, I know that the next set of speakers are going to focus on this quite a bit, but I do think it's worth mentioning. And I avoided it in my opening remarks, just knowing that we had another panel on this. But if you look at the history of Iran, I think you find a very uncertain relationship between economic openings, economic prosperity, and either domestic political restraint or regional restraint. So, for example, the periods of greatest progress in terms of Iran's evolution in a positive fashion, both at home and abroad, did not occur during times of economic largesse. And we have not seen in the past that economic openings, for example, after the war and even continuing and intensifying during the Khatami period, actually helped those forces who were trying to liberalize Iran, at least with respect to its foreign policy or its domestic politics. So I actually don't see any short-term possibility that the kind of reopening of trade and the return to Iran of major international companies, many of whom have been there in the past, is likely to bring about, at least in the short term, the kind of positive political change that certainly many Iranians hope for. I think the near-term benefits are primarily or disproportionately going to accrue to those with access to the benefits of power within Iran, which tends to be either those closest to the regime and or aspects of the Revolutionary Guard and the security forces. And so those are going to be the players that are least interested in seeing genuine liberalization, transparency, and accountability within the system. In the long term, absolutely. I don't think that Iran is China. It's not an economic player large enough to bend the forces of the market to its will. And so if you look in 30, 40, 50 years in Iran without international trade versus in Iran fully reintegrated in the international trade and financial systems, the latter will be far more liberalized than the former. But in the relevant period of time for this deal, for this administration, and for the way that people in policy positions think, business isn't really a panacea to the problems of Iranian extremism, either at home or abroad.
A question in the back, there in the middle.
Thank you. My question to Dr. Melissa, you mentioned the concern of Arab states in Yemen and Syria, and President Obama said that the next administration will be focused on counter ISIS in the Middle East. So what's your assessment for the American or coalition approach to counter ISIS next year? Just focus on at the end of this administration. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think that there's been a lot of emphasis on the airstrike dimension of the coalition efforts, and I think the fact that Arab partners have stepped up to be a part of that coalition, particularly in the early days, and I think the United States is seeking to ensure that those partners can be resupplied in order to continue to be strong members of the coalition. I think has built some good momentum for the future of what multilateral security cooperation could look like in the region, and then specifically to address the threat of the Islamic State, which is a long-term generational challenge for the region. So this is a good development, but it is exclusively just focused on the airstrike campaign without the ground component, and there's been a lot of public debate and commentary, about the paucity of the Syria Train Equip program. Only 60 fighters that have made it through the training program thus far, although I will note, knowing from colleagues that work these issues inside of government, that the funding and authorities to be in that program only were authorized earlier this year. So the program has been, in fact, talked about for a couple of years, or year and a half, but has in actuality only been up and running for a few months. So hopefully more to come on that. And then on the Iraqi side, this is not a new observation, but the importance of bringing in the Sunni tribes, and along the lines of what was attempted in 2008, I think is a critical piece that the United States and the Iraqis and the greater region are working towards, but far more work to be done there. The bottom line is that in the absence of a ground campaign to complement the air campaign, we're just not going to make inroads to contain and push back the Islamic State. And that's just the military piece. There is, of course, the political dimension, which I referred to earlier in the conversation, that there just needs to be a more robust multilateral effort on the part of the regional Arab partners, European allies, the United States, to push forward on political solutions for both Iraq and Syria. We can't afford to let the the Syria side slide any more than it already has. Understandably, the focus has been on securing the Iran nuclear deal, but perhaps Iran and Russia have a role to play in pressuring Assad to come to the negotiating table.
Another question? Let's go over here.
Hi, my name is Rami Hassan. You mentioned allaying the fears of our allies. Are we actually able to do that? I know you mentioned the Israelis, because they just never seem to be satisfied unless we're on a war footing with Iran. And do you think that's possible? Because at what point do we stop apologizing for making peace?
I think
I don't think that's they would accept your characterization at all. I think they were hoping that the U.S. in their view would try to eliminate the nuclear threat, really block the pathways, not just delay for 15 years in that case. So they think, the Prime Minister says it paves the way for them to have a nuclear bomb. I think it's a nuanced picture, like I said, on the plutonium. I think it really is blocked. I think for 15 years it takes down the stockpile of uranium. I think it puts a cap on the centrifuges. I think those are real achievements. But if you lived over there, you would see it maybe differently, that it doesn't block the way the president claims it does, and that there's going to be a huge cash infusion to the allies that they're going to suffer the brunt of when they have fought, 3 wars with Hamas in 6 years. They fought Hezbollah. Nasrallah says he's got 100,000 rockets. This is all before any infusion. So, I don't think they would accept the way you characterized it at all. But I didn't say that the answer, therefore, is to scuttle the deal. I think it could be that for those who think that this deal should be kept, that there's ways to work the edges of it. And I tried to give some practical recommendations, but it's not if you're against peace or something like that. And I don't think the answers are wars. I mean, I think we should give this thing a chance. To the extent that this deal will have an impact, people in Iran look at the region differently as a result of globalization? Certainly people hope so. But they're also aware that Iran isn't a democracy, that in 2009, 2 million people came to the streets, and the leadership crushed them. So the majority might want a different future because of globalization and economic incentives and all those nice things, but they, the people who fire the shots tend to call the shots over there, and therefore maybe it'll work, and maybe it's worth giving it a shot. But I think there are limitations, and the question is, can you work the edges to minimize those risks?
So we have just a couple minutes left, so what I'm going to do is take a couple of remaining questions and maybe do one last round through the group and call it. So, Laura.
Thank you all for doing this. I'm Laura Rosen from Al Monitor. David, this sounds more naive than I think it is. The German economics minister has been in Iran, and as soon as he landed, he told the press that Iran can't enjoy full economic reintegration with Europe and Germany without stopping threatening Israel's existence. And the next day, the MFA spokeswoman for Iran, said, well, we're not going to start relations with Israel. But it was just interesting at all that it was being covered in the Iranian press. Could there be some indirect mediation or where Israel's bare minimum from Iran could be communicated, and Iran, for pragmatic reasons, not ideological reasons, might be persuaded to follow those red lines?
Well, let me take a couple more questions, then we'll do one quick round. I think that was definitely going to David. Other right over here.
Hi, I'm Cheryl from the Singapore Embassy. I have just two quick questions. When we heard from John Wolfstall that it takes about $900 billion to bring the Iranian economy back on track, and that we expect about $100 billion on sanctions relief, and it will probably take some time for the economy to get kick-started. My question is there a kind of mismatch in expectations between what the Iranian people expect and what the Americans and European negotiators expect to happen, and is this potentially destabilizing for the deal? And my second question is,
I'm sorry, can we do just one question, because we're so tight on time? I'll take one more question from the audience. Right in the very back, standing up, gentlemen.
Hi, I'm Dan Harris with the Age Group. Thank you very much for having this discussion. I wanted to ask what effect, if any, you think that this agreement might have on the upcoming elections to the Iranian Majlis and the Assembly of Experts. I think that is something that we'd all like to hear.
Well, maybe we can start with Suzanne and go down the line. That last one sounded like it was right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, and I'm going to take the liberty of saying a word on Laura's question, even though I know it was meant for David and for Melissa. In terms of the Majlis elections, look, Iran has so many ways to influence the outcome of elections. It doesn't need to do a deal to get a certain election outcome. And I think, like most countries, domestic elections tend to be influenced, particularly within the parliament, which has a kind of very long history in Iran. And a lot of local politics engaged are not influenced so much by broad international threats or opportunities as they are by local and domestic priorities in politics. So, I'm sure that it will be watched closely. It has always served as a kind of bellwether of political trends within Iran. When we saw the rise of neoconservatives in Iran, we saw it first in city councils and then in the parliament. So I think we'll all be watching to see what happens, but I don't know that the deal itself will influence it. A mismatch of expectations, that will be very much up to the Iranian government. And I think Rouhani, in fact, has a great technical team on the economic side, and they're going to work very hard to avoid some of the mistakes of the past in terms of managing this large influx. That's aside from the sort of questions about where does it flow or how much does it flow to the Revolutionary Guard or terrorist proxies. The Iranians have perhaps a more prosaic concern, inflation and the overheating of the economy. So it is going to be a real challenge to manage this shift, both the kind of return of the international financial system and companies, but also the massive amount of money that's going to come in, first through the release of the assets that have been held abroad, and then eventually through trade and investment. So it's a challenge. I don't know that popular expectations are likely to be disappointed, if only because Iranians are so used to their government not living up to the expectations of economic progress. And just a word on the Germans and the Israeli question. The Germans are not likely to serve as a really useful prod, despite whatever rhetoric might have been used on the visit. The Germans historically were one of Iran's largest trade partners and are likely to be the biggest beneficiaries on the European side, although the French are going to give them a run for their money from the reopening. And in effect, I think the bigger concern is, are they going to be the weak link within the Joint Commission and the implementation of the deal? The question of, can Iran be convinced to change its approach to Israel through some kind of pragmatism about retaining this new relationship with the world? The simple reality is that no one in Iran, and certainly no one else in the international community, believes there's even the remotest possibility of the reconstitution of the sanctions that we've seen over the course of the past 5 years on the basis of Iran's support for terrorism, ever. Short of some sort of extraordinary provocation. And so without that kind of an incentive to change posture, I'm skeptical.
And Melissa and Dave, can I ask you guys to keep it very brief since
Yep.
we're basically out of
Sorry.
Just in brief, pivoting off of the expectations and perceptions of the Iranians, receiving this economic windfall with the lifting of sanctions. Interesting to see how that may play out in the Gulf, because with the heightened expectations and with this growing propensity for independent action, the 29-year-old defense minister in Saudi, will the Saudis and other Gulf partners potentially make somewhat rash decisions that are not entirely consistent with U.S. interests? I think we've seen this playing out in Yemen. Could it happen in other areas as they expect that the Iranians may up their game asymmetrically? I think is an area to watch.
Well, to Laura Rosen's question, whether the Germans are the right, messengers for that, even though I should say they have been kind of one of Israel's best friends in Europe. And I'm not saying it's not heartfelt, but Suzanne gave the other side of the ledger in terms of their economic activity. I think others undoubtedly will make the same point, but it's, and in this world where there's track 2 messages and everyone's talking to everybody in a certain level, if Iran had that interest, I have no doubt that the Israelis would want to improve those relations. But I think you could ask the question, once Iran has gotten this deal and got close to whatever it wanted without paying any price in that coinage, what incentive does Iran have for doing that, after the deal? So if there's a will, there's a way. I just don't see the incentive for their will. The Ayatollah, I think, tweets out every couple months, here are the 9 ways to eliminate Israel. And now is going to get a nuclear arsenal within 15 years. So there's a question here. And, some people say the forces of globalization are stronger than anything. And if so, that will be transformational. This will be transformational on so many levels in terms of relations, dynamics within the Middle East. But whether it'll be transformational in that sense, I think certainly is yet to be seen.
Well, I'd like to just thank our panelists. I thought it was a really rich and interesting discussion. And now we're going to be handing it over to Zach Goldman and for a discussion on the economics of the Iran deal. But just I want to say thank you again to Suzanne and Melissa and David.
Thank you.